Welcome back to Complete Aviation Solutions. This is deep dive number 53.
53.
Wow.
That's a lot of deep dives.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
We're going to be diving deep today into some pretty fascinating developments that we're seeing in the airline industry.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time
Yeah, it really is.
to be following the industry and to be a part of it.
For sure. So we've got some reports here from April 7th of 2025.
Okay.
And looking at these reports, it really seems like there's a lot of changes afoot.
Yeah, there are for sure.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at how Canadian airlines are kind of like rejiggering their operations in the U.S. market.
LA?
There's a big merger happening in the U.S. regional airline sector.
Huge.
And also some new regulations that are affecting international airlines flying into Nigeria.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. But I think it's important stuff, and I think that our listeners can really benefit from getting a better understanding of what's going on.
For sure. I think all this stuff has implications for passengers and for the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in, shall we?
Let's do it.
All right. So first up, let's talk about what's going on with air travel between Canada and the United States.
Oh.
So it seems like Canadian airlines are seeing a bit of a shift in where their passengers want to fly.
Interesting.
So we have information showing that WestJet has actually made some pretty significant cuts to its summer 2025 schedule for U.S. routes.
Okay.
So what do you make of that?
Well, the data seems to indicate that there's a real change in where Canadians are choosing to travel.
Yeah.
And WestJet specifically is saying that there's more demand for flights going south to sun destinations, places like Mexico and the Caribbean.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. People want to get away from the cold.
Exactly. And they're also seeing more bookings for European travel as well.
Oh, interesting.
So it looks like Canadians are maybe prioritizing different kinds of vacations this year.
Right. Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's not just talk. They're actually making changes to their routes based on this information.
Right.
So WestJet is going to be suspending 2 of its seasonal U.S. routes.
Okay.
The Edmonton to Orlando route and the Calgary to New York LaGuardia route.
Interesting.
And it's not just the bigger airlines making adjustments here. Flair Airlines, which is an ultra low-cost carrier,
Right.
they've canceled 3 U.S. routes, so Toronto to Nashville and Las Vegas from both Calgary and Edmonton.
Oh, wow.
And then they even moved up the suspension of 4 other U.S. routes.
So they were already planning to suspend them, but
Yeah, but they moved it up by like almost a month in some cases.
that's a pretty clear sign
It is, yeah.
that demand just isn't there.
Yeah, it seems like they're seeing that those routes just aren't as profitable as they were hoping.
Yeah. And for people who were relying on those budget flights,
Oh, yeah.
this could mean fewer choices and maybe even higher fares on other routes.
Yeah, that's a good point. This could really impact travelers who are looking for the most affordable options.
For sure.
So it's not just WestJet that's seeing this trend either. Air Canada, which is the biggest Canadian airline,
Right.
they're also noticing a decline in bookings for U.S. flights.
Wow.
Their data shows a 10% drop in U.S. bookings for the first 6 months of this year,
Okay.
from April to September compared to the same time last year.
Interesting.
And even the chairman of Air Canada has said that he's concerned about this trend.
I mean, 10% for an airline that size, that's a significant change.
It is a lot, and it really shows you that something is going on.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what they're doing internally to adjust to that.
Right.
Are they thinking about changing their routes or their pricing or
Yeah, are they going to cut back on certain flights?
yeah, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so now we get to a bit of a head scratcher.
Okay.
One of the reports that we have actually indicates a really steep drop in passenger bookings on Canada-U.S. routes.
Oh, yeah.
It's saying like a 70% drop in late March of 2025.
Wow, 70%.
That's huge
enormous.
compared to the year before. And they're also saying that airlines are reducing the number of flights available.
Okay.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Air Canada, WestJet, and Porter Airlines all say that this number just doesn't line up with what they're seeing.
Huh. That's strange.
It is. So what do you think could explain such a big difference?
Well, it might just be a matter of where that data is coming from.
Yeah.
Sometimes these reports use aggregate data, which means it's compiled from a bunch of different sources.
Okay.
And that doesn't always give you the most accurate picture of what's happening with individual airlines.
Right.
So it's possible that the report captured a really specific time frame, or they used a method that just wasn't representative.
Hmm.
But the fact that all three of those airlines are pushing back on that number suggests that maybe things aren't as bad as that report made it seem.
Right, yeah. It's like they're all saying, hold on a second, our own data shows something different.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's good to keep in mind that, different sources can have different perspectives on the situation.
Definitely. And sometimes those discrepancies can be really revealing.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Porter Airlines for a second.
Okay.
They're actually expanding their U.S. routes,
Oh,
but
interesting.
they're doing something kind of unusual.
What's that?
They're cutting back on their marketing for those new routes.
Oh, wow. Why would they do that?
Well, it seems like they're worried about how Canadians are going to perceive this expansion into the U.S. market.
Oh, I see. So it's like a PR thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
They don't want people to think that they're prioritizing international growth over serving their domestic customers.
Right, right. They want to make sure Canadians still feel like they're the priority.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So by kind of downplaying the U.S. expansion, they're hoping to avoid any backlash.
Okay. That's a really smart strategy, actually.
It is. It's really interesting to see how these non-economic factors can play such a big role in an airline's decision-making.
Absolutely. It's not just about the numbers. Sometimes it's about public perception and brand image.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
So even though we're seeing some shifts in demand, the U.S. is still a huge market for Canadian airlines.
Right.
Air Canada alone accounts for over 40% of all flights between Canada and the U.S.
Wow.
And they have almost 6,000 flights scheduled just for May.
That's a lot of flights.
It is. It is. And then you've got other big players like United, WestJet, Delta, American.
Right. So even if growth is slowing down,
No.
there's still a ton of travel happening between the two countries.
Yeah, exactly. It's still a really important market for both sides.
Yeah.
And it's not just future bookings that are showing this trend.
No.
Actual travel statistics also paint a pretty clear picture. So Statistics Canada reported a 13.1% drop in Canadian residents returning from the U.S. by air
Okay.
in February of 2025 compared to the year before.
Interesting.
And get this, automobile returns from the U.S. dropped even more,
Wow. How much more?
by 23%.
Wow. So people are even driving less across the border.
Yeah, it seems like it.
That's a big change.
It is. It really reinforces this idea that there are broader factors at play that are affecting travel between the two countries.
Yeah. And it might even suggest that those short trips, the ones that people are more likely to take by car,
Yeah.
that those are being impacted too.
Right. Yeah, people are really thinking twice about traveling to the U.S., it seems like.
Yeah.
And, the information that we have points to some possible reasons for this shift.
Okay. Like what?
Well, there's talk of U.S. tariffs.
Oh, yeah. That could definitely have an impact.
Right. And then there were those comments that President Trump made about Canada.
Right, right.
It seems like those geopolitical factors might actually be influencing people's travel decisions.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, when there's tension between countries, it can definitely make people less likely to visit.
Right, exactly.
And it just goes to show you that the airline industry is really sensitive to the political climate.
Absolutely. What's happening in the world at large can have a direct impact on where people choose to fly.
For sure.
All right, so let's switch gears now.
Okay.
And talk about a pretty big development happening in the U.S. regional airline market.
All right.
So Republic Airways Holdings and Mesa Air Group are merging.
Wow, big news.
Big news. And the combined airline is going to operate under the Republic Airways Holdings name.
Okay.
This is a major shakeup in that part of the industry.
Yeah, it is. And it's going to create one of the biggest regional airlines in the whole U.S.
Exactly. And, they're expecting to finalize this merger pretty soon.
When do they think it'll happen?
Well, they're saying late third quarter or early fourth quarter of 2025.
Okay, so not too far off.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But of course, it still has to get all the regulatory approvals and all that.
Right, of course.
So once this merger goes through, they're going to have a huge fleet of planes.
How many are we talking?
Around 310 Embraer E-170 and E-175 aircraft.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're planning to stick with just those two types of planes.
Okay, so they're going with a single fleet type.
Exactly.
What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it simplifies a lot of things.
Okay.
Like maintenance procedures, pilot training, spare parts, all that stuff.
Right, so it's all about efficiency.
Exactly. Yeah, and that ultimately leads to more reliable and cost-effective operations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, when it comes to ownership of the new company, Republic's shareholders are going to have the lion's share.
Oh, okay. How much are we talking?
88%.
Wow. So they're definitely the dominant partner in this merger.
Yeah, they are. And Mesa's shareholders are going to own somewhere between 6 and 12%.
Okay, so that suggests that Republic was in a stronger financial position going into this.
Right, and that's actually backed up by the information we have.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Mesa Air Group was carrying a lot of debt,
Oh.
and they actually got a warning from NASDAQ because they weren't meeting the requirements to be listed on the exchange.
Oh, wow. So this merger is probably a way for them to get back on solid financial footing.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Interesting.
And when you look at their current fleets, it makes sense why they're moving to an all-Embraer fleet.
Okay, how so?
So Mesa Airlines, they were operating CRJ-900s, but those are currently inactive.
Okay.
And they also have E-175s and even a Learjet.
Wow, a Learjet. That's a pretty fancy plane for a regional airline.
Yeah, it is. And they were actually planning to sell off all their CRJ planes.
Okay, so it sounds like they were already moving towards an all-Embraer fleet,
Right.
and Republic already operates E-170s and E-175s?
Exactly. So this merger just streamlines that transition for them.
Makes sense, yeah.
So this new airline is going to be a big deal.
Okay.
They're going to be operating over 1,250 flights every day.
Wow, that's a lot of flights.
It is. It is. And initially, they're going to keep flying under their existing FAA certificates.
Okay.
But eventually, they'll probably combine everything under one certificate.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Now, here's some good news.
Okay.
They're not planning on laying off any employees because of the merger.
Oh, that's great to hear.
It suggests that they're not trying to cut costs by getting rid of jobs.
Right, and it's good news for the employees of both companies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the new company is going to be called Republic Airways Holdings, and they'll stay listed on NASDAQ under the ticker symbol RJET.
Okay.
And the leadership team is going to come from Republic's existing executives.
Okay, so it sounds like Republic is really the one calling the shots here.
Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting.
But they are adding some people from Mesa to the board of directors.
Okay, so they're trying to make sure that both companies are represented.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And when you look at their networks, it's clear that this merger is going to create a really extensive reach.
Okay, how...
So Republic Airways already serves over 80 cities across North America, the Caribbean, and Central America.
Wow.
And Mesa Airlines serves 89 cities in the U.S., Bahamas, Canada, Cuba, and Mexico.
Wow, so they're covering a lot of ground.
They are. So when you combine those two networks, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and it means that they'll be able to offer passengers a lot of different destinations.
Exactly. And that's good for travelers who are looking for more options.
For sure.
Okay, so let's move on to something completely different now.
Okay.
We need to talk about a regulatory development that's happening in Nigeria.
Right.
So the Nigeria Civil Aviation Authority, or NCAA,
Okay.
they're taking some pretty strong action against international airlines that are doing something pretty shady.
Oh, what's that?
So basically, these airlines are selling tickets to Nigerian passengers,
Okay.
but then when those passengers get to the airport, they deny them boarding or even deport them because of visa issues or other travel restrictions.
Wow, that's awful.
It is. It's a terrible situation, and the NCAA is stepping in to put a stop to it.
Good for them.
Yeah, so they're saying that any airlines that engage in this practice are going to face some serious consequences.
Like what?
Well, they could be fined,
Uh,
or they could even have their flights suspended.
Wow, that's serious.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
Yeah.
And now airlines are required to inform passengers about any potential entry barriers before they even leave for the airport.
Okay, so they have to be upfront about any potential issues.
Exactly, yeah.
And what about the whole visa situation?
Well, they also have to make sure that they're providing accurate information about all the travel documents that passengers need.
Okay, so it's really shifting the responsibility onto the airlines
Yeah,
to
exactly.
make sure that everything is in order before the passengers even get to the airport.
Right, and it seems like the NCAA is doing this because they've received a lot of complaints from passengers who have been unfairly denied boarding or deported.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And they want to protect Nigerian travelers and make sure that Nigeria's aviation industry has a good reputation.
Yeah, that's really important.
It is, and it shows that they're taking passenger rights seriously.
Absolutely. It's great to see a regulator taking such a strong stance on this issue.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that we want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that the airline industry is constantly evolving,
Yeah.
and it's being shaped by all sorts of factors.
Yeah.
Economics, politics, global events.
Right.
And we saw that really clearly in the way that Canadian airlines are adjusting their U.S. operations.
Yeah, those shifting travel preferences and the impact of those geopolitical tensions.
Exactly.
And then we saw how consolidation is playing out in the U.S. regional airline market.
Right. That
Hmm.
merger between Republic and Mesa is a big deal.
Huge,
Yeah, and it's going to have a ripple effect throughout the industry.
for sure.
And then there's the regulatory landscape, which is always changing.
Yeah, the NCAA's actions in Nigeria are a great example of that.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They're really stepping up to protect passengers.
Yeah.
And that's a trend that we're seeing all over the world.
So really, all of these developments are interconnected in a way.
Yeah, they are.
And they're all part of a bigger picture.
Right. And I think it's important for anyone who flies or who's just interested in aviation to understand these trends,
Absolutely.
because it gives you a better sense of how the industry works and how it's changing.
So we've seen how travel preferences can shift in response to global events,
Yeah.
how airlines are adapting to those changes,
Right.
and how regulators are stepping in to make sure that passengers are protected.
Exactly.
So as we leave you today, we want you to think about this.
Okay.
How might all of these shifts in airline operations and regulations affect your own travel plans in the future?
That's a great question.
It's something for all of us to consider.
For sure.
So thanks for joining us for another Dip Dive,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
See you then.